I'd love to introduce Julie, our host today. She is an American author, critic, and storyteller. She's worked at the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. She's written both fiction and nonfiction books for adults and children. And she's produced articles for magazines that include The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Vogue, Bazaar, and The New Republic. Her books have received wide critical and popular attention, and she just completed Unlikely Friends, a memoir for Audible Original, scheduled for release this year. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everybody for lunch, our virtual lunch. So I'm really pleased to have our guest today, Muzzy Rosenblatt. Muzzy is the executive director of the Bowery Residents Committee, BRC, which is an incredible nonprofit working to help New Yorkers experiencing homelessness. And full disclosure, I am the board chair of BRC, so I do have a vested interest in this organization. But even if I weren't, I would be honored to have Muzzy speak to us. BRC, just so you know, is a huge organization now. Its budget is well over $100 million. We provide 3,000 units of housing, shelter, and apartments to New Yorkers who are experiencing homelessness. We have a huge staff, 1,500 people. BRC services about 10,000 people a year, one way or the other. Muzzy is one of the smartest people I know. He's one of the biggest hearted people I know. And he's also now an author, co-author of How Tenant Global Cities Take on Homelessness. It's a really provocative read. He worked on this book with some leaders in the field around the world dealing with the issue of people who have no place to live. We're very lucky to have him with us today to talk about what's going on in New York. And Muzzy, hello.
Hi, Julie.
And I would like to start with this past year. We are, knock on wood, it feels like possibly exiting the pandemic, and I'm knocking on wood again, but it's been a really hard year. And I think it's been a really hard year for both the people BRC serves and the people who work for BRC. So if you could just tell me a little bit about what this year has been like, maybe a couple of the most profound moments for you, positive and negative.
Sure. Well, it is always good to chat with Julie, both in my role as CEO of BRC and her as board chair, but just as a friend. And it's wonderful to share our conversations with an audience because they're always provocative and I always learn something. So I'm looking forward to learn something today, both about myself and the work as well as wherever this conversation will lead us. It has been both an exhausting and exhilarating time, not just for me, but for our whole organization, our enterprise, because we've never stopped. We never do stop. We go 24/7, and that was more critical than ever, but uncertain during the early days, early months of the pandemic. There are so many kind of moments that stand out for me. From the afternoon of March 12th, when I took a walk up 6th Avenue to go meet at a foundation that was considering and did, thankfully, support our work, and the canyons of 6th Avenue in the 40s and 50s were just desolate, and seeing food carts with nobody online at lunch hour. And that was that was even before the shutdown. But then here at BRC and the work we do, from moving our shelters, we're an organization that was founded on the Bowery in the old lodging houses and the old flop houses. So predominantly serving single individuals, marginalized, disenfranchised, with hope and a desire, theirs as well as ours, that given another shot, they could do more and achieve their potential in their lives. So that's always been kind of guiding us. And so the environments in which we do our work, both in shelter and then in housing, are predominantly single individuals, and the shelters that we operate, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, are dormitory style. So one of the biggest challenges that happened during the pandemic was a safety measure to relocate all the shelters in the city into hotels. We did that on about 48 hours notice, and moved everything, moved clients, moved staff, moved files, moved computers, set everything up, created new systems, new ways of working. When everyone's in a private hotel room, it's very different than when everyone's kind of socially gathered. Meals changed from dining together in a cafeteria to grab and go. How we did wellness checks from looking out over a dormitory and making sure people were well to having to enter everybody's room on a regular basis and do so out of the utmost concern for their safety, but doing it in a manner that was as respectful of their privacy and their dignity. The subway shut down. We are the largest provider of outreach services to people living unsheltered on the streets and subways of the city, and we're funded to work predominantly in the subways, and the subways had never closed before, and what that would mean for our clients and where would they go and would places to go be available, and setting those up. We created over 600 beds. But fundamentally, the biggest, I think, challenge and the most incredible and moving and sad in some ways kind of thoughts that I have are our staff, because everything we do is person to person. And so while many could work from home, our staff couldn't. The nature of the job is to be on site, is to be present, and to be there for our clients. But in order for our staff to be there for our clients, we had to be there for our staff. And that meant everything from providing PPE well before people knew what they were. These were things we had. We are a behavioral health organization. We have doctors and nurses. We knew it was a pandemic before people were saying it. I walked into a meeting with our chief medical officer, and she's like, "This is a pandemic." I'm like, "I don't know what a pandemic is." I learned fast. And so we really needed to protect our workers. And there were so many things that we needed to do beyond just the gear, to time off, to providing more health insurance for our new hires. But it all really kind of came home in April, at the end of April, where one of our employees succumbed to COVID. Ron Hurdle, a residential aide in one of our shelters in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, dedicated person, got sick, went to the hospital, and 24 hours later, we lost him. A tragic loss that just made the significance of all of this and the importance of taking care of our staff so that they could take care of our clients ever more real. Thankfully, no one else has been lost since then, but losing Ron is really the thing that stands out most for me out of all of that.
Thank you, Muzzy. Yes, and I think one of the things I think you deal with every day is sort of the depersonalization of all kinds of things, even with COVID, right? It's this mass amount of numbers, and sometimes people forget that there's a lot of human beings attached to that. And with people who are homeless, the same thing. We talk about, quote unquote, the homeless, not realizing that these are people who don't have some place to live. And I guess the next question, I'm going to combine two questions I have. One, which is, I think people have a lot of misconceptions about homelessness, for lack of a better term. I think for a lot of people, there's this push-pull between the compassion and goodwill people might feel for a fellow human being in need, and then also, why are you there? Why are you making my street look not the way I want it to? And so in addressing those misconceptions, I think, what are the questions that people should be thinking about? We've got a mayoral race going on right now. And I've been thinking about this myself. What are the three questions that we should be asking mayoral candidates about these people that people have a lot of misconceptions about?
So a lot there to unpack. Starting with I guess the perceptions and conceptions or misconceptions, and you touched on it, right? Which is To me, homelessness is a situation that people experience too many, too often, and too often too many people of color, disproportionate to their representation in our communities, in our city, in our society, that I think is very much derivative of histories of discrimination in housing, institutional racism, a criminal justice system that treated people of color and treats people of color differently than white people, redlining, various things that just make it so much harder to succeed. So that's obviously definitely part of it, and that's probably straightforward. But so I don't see homeless people. I see people experiencing homelessness, and I think that's important because once we put that scarlet H on somebody, we stigmatize them and we dehumanize them. And what we try to do at BRC is do just the reverse: is bring back the humanity. You know, we had an event, you were probably at it many years ago, Julie, where we were celebrating the successes of our clients who had gone through our shelters and our workforce development programs, and they were alumni coming back, and we were celebrating them, honoring them for what they had achieved, success in not only finding employment and finding housing, but succeeding in it. And then we do this open mic, which is always a risky thing, and clients come up and speak. And so this gentleman, Stanley, came up, and he had been out for a couple of years, and he started telling his story. And you know, we bring a few donors and friends to it, and he gets up and he says, "Hi, I'm Stanley, and I'm doing okay, and but I don't love what I do." And I'm like, "Oh my God, where is this going?" So Stanley had been working for a few years at Fresh Direct, and in fact still does. But he told the story about how he had hit his bottom, how he had struggled with addiction, and his addiction had caused him to lose his home. His wife had actually thrown him out and said, you know, you can choose your family or you can choose your addiction. And Stanley said, I chose my addiction until I was able to free myself of it. And then I came to BRC and I got sober and I got stable and I got my health back and I got a job. And then he said, he said, you know, where I used to work in like tech support in Wall Street. And I'd go to work in a jacket and look good and I got paid well. And now I stand in this cold locker making sandwiches over and over again for the catering side of Fresh Direct. He said, but you know what? While my job isn't as dignified as the job I had before, here's what I love about it. My wife's taken me back. I'm back home and I can be the father that my children need. And I can kiss them goodnight every night, tuck them in, and see them in the morning when they get up. And like you said, there's a lot of data that we use, and data is important. We need to know what works and what doesn't work. But the data is just a tool for us to help a person like Stanley. And to see the humanity in everyone we see and the struggle that they're going through, but with an optimism that they'll succeed if we provide them the support and the love to get there. Does it work all the time? Of course not. Nothing works all the time. Hospitals don't work all the time. Doctors don't succeed all the time. But if we look at the work we do, similar to hospitals, that shelters are places for healing and transforming, that shelters are actually not necessary evils, they're actually necessary goods. They're places for people to go, the good shelters, where people can heal and transform and then leave and not be homeless anymore, because they aren't homeless people. They're people in crisis with individual stories, individual needs, and individual abilities that if we can see through all the pain and the suffering and see the real person there and treat them with respect, then incredible things can happen. And in the same way that no one wants there to be hospitals, but no one could imagine a society without hospitals, because as much as we don't want people to get sick, we know people will. We need to have good places like shelters for people to go, not because we want there to be homelessness, but because we know there will be until we overcome racism, overcome poverty, overcome inequality. We're going to need places for people who are victims of those institutional realities to go to heal. So I guess as relates to the mayors, right? So I've been listening to all of this stuff, as we all have, and I'm not going to endorse anybody. But this work is nuanced, it's complex, as is governing a city. And whether it's about homelessness or anything else, what I haven't heard enough of when people put forward their platforms and their ideas is how will they do it? Because it's less about what we do. That's important. Obviously, we need to do things, but we need to make sure we're doing them well. We need to focus not just on the quantity of what we do, but the quality of what we do. So when people talk about ending homelessness, I have to say I get a little frustrated because it's been around for a long time, and the things that cause it to happen aren't going to go away and aren't within the capacity of any mayor to control. They're giant social forces, and so be honest with me and say we don't want to have shelters, but we know we're going to need to have them. So what we want to do is take a system that needs to do better and help it do better. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to have accountability? How are we going to have adequate funding? How are we going to make sure that the systems that I work in, but the systems that all of us are a part of, whether it's education, healthcare, housing, the environment, the economy, how are you going to actually do that which you say you're going to do? And I think that's the question that isn't being asked enough. No one wants to see people on the street or on the subways, but no one's talking about what does it take to get to a better place.
Right, and I have a follow-up question on that because just for the people listening who don't know this, Muzzy's career began in the government. He was a deputy commissioner and acting commissioner for the Department of Homeless Services, which funds a lot of BRC's work, not all, but a big portion of it. So you've been on both sides of the equation. And so as somebody who came out of city government and deals with both the beneficence and the incredible bureaucratic difficulties of being a beneficiary of city largesse, you know, in the simplest terms possible, what can the government do realistically to make the process less burdensome, to make the process more efficient and more humanistic in the process?
It's a great question, and I think the answer may sound simple, but turning around a bureaucracy is easy, and I've been there. I appreciate that, but I've been there, and I know it can be done as well. And so I think first to kind of just set some context, and then if I get lost, you'll bring me back because you know I kind of go off on tangents. We've got to look at New York in perspective of the rest of the country and the rest of the world, which is what we try and do in the book, which is to recognize that these challenges are not unique to New York. They're not even unique to America. The driving forces, the root causes vary to some degree, city by city and definitely country by country. But we have, for better and for worse in New York City, one of only 3 cities, and for a long time, the only city in the country, a right to shelter. Not a right to housing, but at least a right to go somewhere. And so while we have extraordinary amounts of homelessness in New York, it's not nearly as significant proportionally as other cities. And because of this history of this right that goes back to the late 70s, early 80s, 90% of people experiencing homelessness in New York are in a shelter setting of some sort. There are a variety of different models. About 10% are living outside, which is important, right? Because there's a right here, and we still have 1 in 10 people choosing not to exercise that right. But you go to LA or San Francisco, as I have, or other cities across the globe, and in LA and San Francisco, 90% of the people experiencing homelessness are living outdoors, unsheltered, and only 10% have sheltered because there isn't a right to shelter and there isn't enough. And as tragic and painful and significant, I'm not in any way diminishing the significance both for the person and for our communities of seeing people living on our streets and on our subways. It is exponentially more present in the West Coast cities than it is here. So we are doing something right. And then the question is, trying to get back to the question you asked me, is so what can we do? And that's to recognize that there are things that we're doing that work. And what works most are that there are shelters of quality. And, if you aren't kind of in the thick of it and you're still a smart New Yorker, you probably believe that shelters are bad, that shelters aren't safe, and that shelters don't work. And there are some that aren't that great, no doubt, just like there's some restaurants that aren't that great. There's some stores that aren't that great. There's some hospitals that aren't that great. But there are a lot that are great. There's a lot that's great. And unfortunately, what the bureaucracy, what the government, and I don't say that pejoratively, I was a bureaucrat. I own that. I'm proud of that. But it's a system that is driven more by, partly because of that right to shelter, of having quantity. And there's less in place. I'm not saying the desire isn't there, but the systems aren't in place to focus on quality and accountability and to say which are the shelters that are getting better results, better outcomes, better performance. That's the other book, Getting Results. And how do we invest in those? Like the book says, I didn't realize that as I was saying it. How do we invest in the organizations and the programs, and BRC is only one, that are actually getting results? The average length of stay in a BRC shelter is significantly less than the average length of stay of an average shelter. And so we're moving people through to successful outcomes at a faster rate, at a higher percentage, and seeing extremely low rates of people re-entering the shelter system. All that data exists. So who are the folks who can't do it well? Are they being given the opportunity to improve, told they have to improve? And if they can't improve, then they lose the ability to do the work, and those who can do the work do it. And so I think what we need is a system that has greater accountability and greater expectations around performance, and we'll get more for our money than just more quantity, and probably we'll actually have fewer shelters. Now, some of that we also need more housing, but even with the same level playing field of there's not enough housing, there are shelters that are getting it done to positive results and a much more effective and a much more efficient rate than others.
Thank you. And I think that also for the general public, one of the things that makes the situation more difficult is the only time that, often, I won't say the only time, but frequently, the time that a shelter system appears on the front page of the New York Times is when there's a bad actor, which happened recently. And so it's always very difficult. And one of the things that I think is very good about this book that Muzzy co-authored is that it is instructive to look at what happens in other cities and to see people really thinking in productive ways about how to create a better society across the globe. And one thing I would really, I know the answer to this, but I would really like you to share this with the audience, Muzzy, because this is hard work. And as you can probably tell, Muzzy's a really smart guy. He runs a huge organization. So part of his job is to be a compassionate person with a social worker's heart. And the other part of his job requires him to be a CEO managing a very large, complex organization. And so he could do that somewhere else with a different kind of set of headaches, but probably a lot more financial reward, a lot less dealing with government bureaucracy for sure. And you chose not to do that. You've chosen throughout your life to operate in this space. And it's something whose rewards are many, but there may not be obvious to a lot of people. And I was wondering why you think you landed in this spot.
I mean, I think there are a lot of contributing factors. I think things that led me here, and then, why do I stay? I mean, what led me here was a certain degree of naivete, optimism, and just belief in humanity and belief that, I could make the world a better place, right? My part of Tikkun Olam. It led me here was an upbringing in Jewish spirituality, and that sense of responsibility to our community and to the community of which we are a part, not just the Jewish community, but the community where we are. So that was part of it. I grew up when the city was in the crapper in the 70s, and I saw lots of people leave. I wasn't, our family wasn't in a position to leave. We got a great deal on real estate as a result. Who would have known? It was a bargain for my parents to go from being a renter to being an owner back in the 70s. And so we stayed. And well, I can't say you, Julie, or you, anybody out there, or one, but me, it still was very hard to be present and not feel the pain and suffering of others in a city that had still so much wealth and resources and a society. And so I think intellectually for me, it was always trying to reconcile that. How do we not just be selfish, but how do we, and I want comforts like everyone else, no doubt, but how do we do more for those who have the least? And so that's always been kind of my guiding light. And then along the way, I went from being an idealist to being a pragmatist, learning in government and then learning running an organization. That easier to say, harder to do. But I love the challenge of it. And so why take on these headaches? Because the reward is so, though it may not be remuneratively generous, though it's fine. I'm not here to negotiate with my board chair for a raise. But what is so rewarding, and not something that a board could ever give, the work gives it, is to see people succeed, is to see people like Stanley, is to be out with our outreach workers, in the early morning hours or the afternoon hours, 24/7, extending themselves to people who are fragile, who are fearful, and to see relationships built and trust built. And somebody who for the longest time was afraid to accept help, accept it. I can't think of anything more satisfying than to see human relationships come together and people to help each other. We struggle through so much right now, I think, in our world, of seeing hate and misunderstanding and animus that has built up over decades, built up over centuries, built up over longer than that. To be able to go to work every day and see people come together, to see people reach out to each other and help each other and lift each other up. I mean, please don't ever take that away from me.
Don't worry.
Okay.
I forgot to mention to the audience, if anybody has a question that I'm not asking, you can put your questions in the chat, and I'll be checking on that periodically. I forgot to say that at the beginning. Muzzy, you and I come from a similar background in that we both have families that had experiences with the Holocaust and have had experiences being part of families that became dispossessed because of who they were. And it's hard for me not to think that in some ways has led to your being where you are. You write about that in the book a little bit. And if you could just tell a little bit about your family story, because the truth is sometimes being dispossessed does not lead to more empathy. It leads to more, I got mine now and I've suffered and that's enough.
Right. And yeah, so, I mean, I think that's part of why I do the work is I think always just been curious when I see somebody is how could this have happened? How could you be in a situation where you're living on the street and all you have is what you can carry with you? And the more I became aware of my own family story, the more I realized how quickly things can unravel. So my dad was born in Vienna in 1933, and they were a very well-to-do family. My grandfather, his father, was an established doctor. was a decorated lieutenant who fought in World War I on the front for the Austrian army, had served his country honorably, was a proud Austrian, and then one night it all got taken away, and my grandfather was arrested, and there are different stories which I am not going to share about how he was released, but he was. And with a reminder that the Anschluss had happened, but the Nazis had not yet come into Austria. And so the police commandant who had arrested him released him and said, but if I arrest you again, I won't be able to help you. So leave. So they packed up and left, within 48 hours, spent 2 years in a refugee camp in Lisbon in Portugal, waiting for a visa, and then arrived on the Upper West Side, which, to me as a kid, Upper West Side is like, you couldn't be cooler than that. But, by the time my dad got here, he was 8 years old. He didn't speak English. There was no such thing as ESL. There was just English, and sink or swim, kid, and find a home, grandpa, and find a job, and with what you got. And so it helped me realize, I think, that it's fragile, it's tenuous, and what it can feel like to be that other. And I'm not saying we're all a paycheck away from homelessness. I don't subscribe to that. Some of us are more fortunate than others. Some of us have better support systems than others. But the fragility is there. The ability to have something and then have it taken away, or to lose it, and then to suddenly find yourself pleading and begging on the mercy of others, is a horrific experience, has to be a horrific, traumatic experience. And if everyone is walking by you or just throwing food or money at you, that's not what you need. What you need is someone to care. What you need is someone to listen. What you need is someone to hear your story and help you navigate it. You want to do this yourself, but you just need someone to guide you. And where everybody's trying to go is different, and everybody's story is different. And a sandwich and a buck is not going to get you there. But compassion and empathy, and then some skill, right? We're not a bunch of volunteers. We are paid professionals. And we take the time to get to understand and diagnose with each person what it is that can best help them. And then offer it, not compel it, not coerce it, not mandate it, but offer it. And usually the first time it's rejected because we're strangers. But over time, we build that relationship, we build the trust. And then through that, we're able to overcome the fear. And if we can do that, then we've done our job. And I think that's what I take from what has to have been part of the emotional experiences that my family went through as strangers in a strange land.
Thank you, Muzzy. So we're starting to get some questions in through the chat, so I want to give those priority now. Somebody asks a question. I think you've been very persuasive in presenting BRC, because somebody asked, can a person who's homeless ask to be placed at BRC in particular versus another shelter in New York?
So if only, we allowed customers to choose, wouldn't that be a great thing? Because I think there'd be a line outside our doors, and that would be part of that kind of performance-driven system that would say, for those that are demanded, they get to do the work, and for those that are not desired, see ya. Sorry. I mean, it should matter that, and this is not about being competitive. There are lots of great organizations, but there's lots, and everyone who needs help should know that there's the ability to go to a great place to get it. And that isn't always the case. But there are rules, and we don't set them. We are by and large not the gatekeepers to our own facilities. We are contracted for much of what we do. We're part of a larger system. That's a good thing, right? It's good that the city has a right to shelter rather than being Los Angeles. It's good that we're funded by taxpayer dollars to at least do the core of what we do. I welcome your contributions, because the part that takes us from being good to being great is that marginal dollar that we use philanthropic dollars for, that allows us to complement the mandatory services we provide with the extra services and the training and the qualitative work that we do and the data analysis that we do. But the city, there's a central point of intake where somebody in need would go and then be assigned. There are a few exceptions to that. Our outreach workers are also gatekeepers. They can diagnose and make a referral based on where beds are available. Our beds are pretty full, no surprise, and try and get somebody in a BRC program if they are clinically appropriate for that. But all to say to the questioner, if somebody just said, hey, get me to BRC, not that easy, not impossible, but not likely, not on first blush. If I were mayor, I would change that. I would create a system that was allowed. I believe in customer choice. I believe people do have agency. I think people have the right to make mistakes. I think people have the right to make choices, and everyone's motivation is different. Someone may want the shelter that's nearby because they want to be close to their family, and that's most important. Somebody else may be willing to go halfway across the city in order to get right. I think there are very few parents who would say, oh no, Stuyvesant or Bronx Science are too far away. I don't want to take the trip to get a high quality education. No, we know there's a line to get into those schools, and if only everyone who wanted to go could go, that would be a great thing. So we're not there yet, sadly.
So the next question comes from Ruth Messenger, who I'm happy to say is in the audience. Nice to see your name here, Ruth. And she,
especially since I grew up in her house.
So Ruth asks an excellent question, no surprise, which is what kind of coordination is needed between street workers, outreach workers, benefit providers, counselors, and so on that does not now exist? Where are the weak points in the system?
Sure. So first, hi Ruth. It's great to not see you, but know that you're there. Miriam, Ruth's daughter, and I, best friends from high school, Hunter College High School. And I spent probably, as much time in Ruth's house as I spent in my own. She's kind of like a surrogate mom to me. So I love her. I love you. Probably to share too much there, sorry. But in any event, so there is actually more coordination than I think most people suspect. There's actually a pretty robust system in place where between, for example, we do a lot of the work, or almost all the work, in the New York City subways. We have regular what are called roundtable meetings with New York City Transit Operations, NYPD, MTA, outreach, all the different outreach organizations, those above ground and as well as those below ground, the Department of Homeless Services, to see where the needs are greatest, to continue to allocate resources to where we see trends and patterns, to track some of the most vulnerable and the most needy clients that we see out there who are nomadic and transient by their nature. So they may be, down at Union Square this month, but for whatever reason, they may wind up being out at the Barclays Center Atlantic Terminal the next month. And so ensuring that there's that communication. There's also a robust data system for tracking where somebody's been placed, so that when we see them and encounter them, we can know where have you been before and talk about what's worked and what hasn't worked. We use our own robust data set so we can build on the work each outreach worker does and know that maybe the day team saw this person yesterday and put in a note, notice that they were responding to internal stimuli, make sure that they're safe, and we can begin to build on that work and not start fresh each time. That said, where I think the bigger breakdowns are, and I would argue the biggest breakdowns, are the lack of connection between different systems, right? Because our clients are not products of systems, they're human beings. So they may have been or may be in the foster care system, or they may have dropped out of school, or they may have been released from Rikers or from prison. And those systems don't talk to each other at all. And So for example, the criminal justice system, the state prisons, know when people are being released, and the amount of discharge planning that they do to prepare somebody for where they might go is non-existent, even though they know the date that that person's going to get out. We know the date that a young person is going to age out of foster care. How is it that we don't have a plan for that? There's some who are motivated to do. I'm not suggesting every child has no plan. And then how do we connect those systems and prepare for that? The healthcare system. I mean, we have a good relationship with the city's Health and Hospitals Corporation, and we've made a lot of progress. But when they're ready to discharge a patient that we brought in perhaps a week earlier, there is not enough of a system in place. Sometimes we have a doctor that knows us. Sometimes we have a nurse or a social worker, at Bellevue, at Harlem, at Metropolitan, who knows us and says, hey, we've stabilized Muzzy, but now there's a plan. And the last thing we want to see happen is Muzzy wind up back on the street, back in the subways without continuity of care. Those systems aren't in place in a systemic way, to be redundant, to ensure that people aren't falling into those cracks. And those cracks are canyons.
Muzzy, thank you so much. We're getting close to the end of the allotted time. We have 2 more questions in the chat, which I really would like to address. We can go a couple of minutes over. The first question, I think, is about what unique programs we have that make a difference in the lives of your formerly homeless residents. For that question, I would recommend going to brc.org because there's a very good explanation of a lot of our different programs. I recommend looking at the Landing Roads site because it's about a new way of developing affordable housing that BRC developed, but probably a little too complicated to go in now. I also recommend people read the book, How 10 Global Cities Take on Homelessness, because it has innovations that work. And I think it's a really, really excellent guide to ways that people are thinking intelligently and thoughtfully about these problems. But somebody asked about, and we don't have a lot of time, but I think it's a question that people are concerned about. There was a recent vote in Austin, Texas, which banned homeless camping, among other things. So they're asking about that, in particular about outcomes from that policy. But I'd like you to talk just for a minute about people who see similar kinds of things on the streets of New York, somebody lying there with a lot of stuff. How are we supposed to respond to that? What are the legal issues involved? But more importantly, ethically and humanely, how do we respond to that as people?
Right. So there's as much pain as there is to see somebody in crisis. We should be comforted to know that BRC and many other organizations, Breaking Ground, CUCS, Bronx Works, Project Hospitality, all together are responsible and are going 24/7. We're not, we're limited by how many beds are available for us to go to, and we're limited by how many staff we have, but we get everywhere and we get to anyone. So if you do call us or call 311, we're told about it and we can go out there. And not to see it as a nuisance, though it may be, I understand that, but that the way the problem will get solved is not by criminalizing it, because what that means effectively is that people will be moved if indeed they're illegal, and usually they know the law better than any of us do. So basically the law, just to pivot to that for a second, is that people have a right to be on shelter as long as the manner in which they set themselves up does not create a public safety hazard. So if they're sleeping on the stairs to the subway, that's a safety hazard. If they're blocking the emergency exit to a theater, that's a safety hazard. If they're sleeping in the doorway of an abandoned store, it's not a safety hazard. If they're tucked under a scaffold but not in any way obstructing the pedestrian thoroughfare. And so there's no legal remedy for that, nor do most legal remedies lead to significant and systemic change? What works is, A, we created a new shelter model that isn't a shelter. It looks like one, called a safe haven, which was kind of the real precursor to the book. It was when my co-author, Linda Gibbs, who was deputy mayor under Mayor Bloomberg, said, why, when there's a right to shelter, are people still voting with their feet not to come in? Let's create something. So we created something that went back to our roots on the Bowery, which said, come as you are, no rules. To the point of the earlier questioner, you want to walk into the safe haven? Come on in. Anything that will get you to choose in versus out, we'll embrace it, and then we'll work from there. And it's a model that works and that we've expanded, and we write about it in the book, that there are models and innovations that work, because we're never going to end homelessness. If anyone wants a prescription for ending homelessness, it doesn't exist other than ending poverty and racism. And so until then is, what are strategies that work for people so that people can transition from homelessness to home, which is what we consider BRC, a pathway from homelessness to home. And so we are out there building those relationships. What we don't want to see is somebody swept away, because then we've got to start all over again. You know, if I met you, Julie, you know, at the bar the other night, and I, you know, said, you know, can I call you again? And you gave me the brush off. My instinct would be, well, maybe I'll see you again back at the bar. But if you're not back at the bar, I'll never see you again. So what we want is to be able to build those relationships, to keep coming back. If you call us and we show up, sometimes I get these phone calls. Those are outreach workers in Orange. Sorry, we're there. You know, they showed up and then they left the person, because people have a right to be left alone. But if we build that relationship of trust, over time, somebody says, okay, you left me alone because I asked you to leave me alone. I respect you for that. Now I need a doctor. Will you take me to the doctor? Yes, I'll take you to the doctor. Now I need a shower. Will you take me for a shower? I'll take you for a shower. Now I need a bed. Can you get me a bed? I'll take you to a bed. And so it takes time to build trust, to build relationships, but that is what we need to do. And we need to be patient, not accept it, but accept that it takes time.
Muzzy, thank you so much. I mean, there's so many more things to talk about. We are out of time and over time. I really appreciate this conversation. I'm pleased to have it within this organization, because the work you're doing, as you said, is very much in the spirit of Tikkun Olam and very much a part of the American Jewish Historical Society's mission. And thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. It is about people. I can't help but reinforce, as we began the conversation, that it is an extraordinary team of over 1,000 individuals here that do this work with heart, with passion, and with creativity and competence and professionalism 24 hours a day. It never ends, but every day it ends for somebody. Every day, homelessness is ending in the life of somebody. And that's what keeps giving me hope, is that while the need is always there, people are recovering, people are transforming, and people are healing every day. And I appreciate the opportunity to share our work with everybody here. Thank you.